The drawing room, which Whimsy had noted upon his arrival, possessed all the aesthetic charm of a particularly ambitious funeral parlor, all heavy velvet curtains, mahogany furniture carved with the grim determination of the Victorian artisan, and an overwhelming number of antimacassars, fell into a silence that was broken only by the measured ticking of the mantelpiece clock and the faint sound of Mrs. Ashcroft setting down her teacup with deliberate care. Whimsy, observing this reaction with the trained eye of a man who had spent considerable portions of his life in drawing rooms deducing the truth from infinitesimal variations in human behavior, turned away from the window and settled himself into one of the chairs with the casual grace of a man entirely at ease in his surroundings. He had not, he remarked conversationally, intended to cast aspersions upon the deceased's character or the manner of his demise, but merely to observe that the shutter in question bore the distinct appearance of having been manipulated recently, indeed within the past day or so, judging by the slight discoloration of the metal at the latch where the patina had been disturbed. It was, he suggested, the sort of thing one noticed when one had spent rather too much time examining old houses and their various architectural peculiarities, a consequence of having been dragged about Europe by his mother during his formative years, ostensibly for cultural enrichment, but actually, he suspected, to avoid creditors of a particularly insistent disposition. Catriona had recovered somewhat from her initial pallor, though Whimsy noted that her fingers were gripping the armrest of her chair with rather more force than social convention typically demanded. She had inquired, in a tone that attempted and nearly achieved nonchalance, why he supposed this detail of any particular significance, given that the doctors had already determined that poor Corsham had succumbed to a perfectly natural cardiac event. The servants, after all, were frequently opening and closing shutters. It was part of their daily routine. And really, one could not expect Mrs. Pemberton, who was getting on in years and had a tendency toward forgetfulness, to remember precisely which shutters had been opened when. This explanation was delivered with the smooth efficiency of a woman practiced at managing awkward social situations and had the peculiar effect of making Whimsy regard his hostess with renewed interest. It was not, he reflected, the response one would expect from an innocent party merely making polite conversation. An innocent party would have said something to the effect of how curious and then allowed the matter to drop. Instead, Catriona had launched into a detailed justification for the state of the shutters, which suggested that either she had been thinking about the shutters a considerable amount, or she had anticipated that someone, perhaps someone with Lord Peter's unfortunate reputation for noticing things, might eventually ask about them. Before Whimsy could pursue this line of inquiry further, there came the arrival of Inspector Carlyle from the local constabulary, a man of the type who had clearly received his training during that period in English law enforcement, when suspicion was regarded as a sign of criminal tendency and logical analysis was considered unnecessarily complicated when compared to the straightforward approach of accepting whatever explanation presented itself first. The inspector was, however, not unintelligent, merely limited in his imagination and possessed of that peculiar confidence that comes from never having encountered a problem that could not be solved by applying the same solution that had worked for the previous problem. He greeted Whimsy with the wary respect of a man who understood that his lordship had a reputation for interfering in official investigations, though he would not, he said pointedly, be expected to take precedence over the established authorities in this matter. This declaration was made whilst simultaneously offering Whimsy a cigarette from his case, a social gesture that rather undermined the assertion of authority that had preceded it, and inquiring whether his lordship had any observations to contribute regarding the late Mr. Corsham's untimely demise. Whimsy had accepted the cigarette with grave courtesy, and had remarked that the only observation he had made thus far was a somewhat trivial one regarding the state of the library shutters, which had appeared to him to have been opened and closed with unusual frequency, compared to the other windows in the house. This detail, he suggested, might be entirely innocent, a consequence of the servants attending to ventilation, or of Mr. Corsham himself preferring fresh air to the somewhat oppressive atmosphere that tended to accumulate in libraries. Alternatively, It might indicate nothing whatsoever of significance, and was merely the sort of thing that tended to lodge itself in the mind of persons who had spent too much time reading detective novels and not enough time engaging in productive labor. He had then inquired whether the inspector had observed anything curious about the position of the body or the arrangement of the room itself, remarking that he had noticed the book beside Mr. Corsham appeared to have been positioned with rather more precision than one might expect from a man in the grip of a sudden cardiac event. Most individuals, in his experience, tended to drop whatever they were hold when mortality unexpectedly intervened. The book, however, was positioned with the open pages facing upward and the spine aligned quite perfectly with the edge of the chair's armrest, the sort of arrangement that suggested either remarkable coincidence or deliberate placement after the fact. The inspector's expression had shifted from defensive to thoughtful, and it was at precisely this moment that Whimsy had observed the color drain from Catriona's face a second time, accompanied by a slight tremor in her hand that caused her to set down her own teacup with an audible click against the saucer. She had then announced, quite suddenly and with the brittleness of a woman reaching the limits of her composure, that she believed she was developing a migraine of considerable severity and would have to retire to her room immediately. Would Lord Peter and the inspector excuse her? She had stood before either man could respond, smoothed her skirts with hands that were not entirely steady, and departed the drawing-room with the measured precision of a woman engaged in an elaborate performance of normalcy. When she had gone, the grandfather clock in the entrance hall chimed the hour, and Whimsy had settled back into his chair with the expression of a man who had just observed a crucial piece of a particularly complex puzzle fall unexpectedly into place. Inspector Carlyle had watched Catriona's departure with the expression of a man observing a phenomenon he did not entirely comprehend, but had learned through long experience not to question too directly. He turned to Whimsy once the drawing-room door had closed with a soft but definitive click and inquired, with the cautious tone of a subordinate officer addressing a superior of uncertain temperament, whether his lordship believed there was something irregular about Mrs. Ashcroft's behavior. Whimsy had smiled, that peculiar smile, which suggested he found the inspector's question simultaneously amusing and touching in its earnest simplicity, and had remarked that Mrs. Ashcroft's behavior was precisely what one might expect from a woman who had recently discovered that a matter she believed safely concluded had suddenly become considerably more complicated. Whether this indicated guilt, complicity, or merely guilty knowledge of an entirely different variety remained to be determined through the tedious process of investigation. He had then suggested that they might profitably spend the next hour examining the library in detail, with particular attention to the window in question, and any traces that might indicate whether it had been opened from the interior or the exterior, or indeed whether it had been opened at all in recent memory, the whole business being rather more complex than one might initially suppose. The library at Ashcroft Manor was the sort of room that appeared in architectural journals and made other men of property deeply envious. High ceilings with ornamental plasterwork, bookshelves rising to considerable heights, and a collection of volumes that suggested either genuine erudition or the services of an exceptionally competent antiquarian book dealer, which amounted to much the same thing in practical terms. The windows, tall and narrow in the Victorian fashion, looked out onto the terrace and beyond that to the formal gardens where various shrubs had been pruned into shapes that nature had never intended. Whimsy had proceeded immediately to the left shutter, which had been the subject of his earlier observation, and had examined it with the concentration of a man engaged in archaeological investigation. The latch mechanism was standard brass, well maintained but not obsessively polished, the sort of detail that suggested it received attention from the servants but not particular reverence. However, upon closer inspection with the aid of the light from the window, Whimsy had observed that the metal bore distinct scratches around the latch area, scratches of the sort that might be produced by a small implement, a penknife perhaps or a screwdriver, being inserted and manipulated with neither excessive care nor particular brutality. Inspector Carlyle had leaned forward to examine the scratches and had pronounced them insignificant, likely the result of normal wear and tear accumulated over years of use. Whimsy had regarded him with the patient expression of a tutor addressing a particularly obstinate pupil, and had inquired whether the inspector noticed that these particular scratches, whilst superficially appearing to be the product of age and ordinary use, were in fact considerably lighter in colour than the surrounding metal, which suggested they had been produced within a relatively recent time frame, within days rather than months. Furthermore, if one examined the surrounding area with appropriate care, one would observe that there appeared to be microscopic traces of what might be described as fibre, perhaps wool or linen, caught within the mechanism, the sort of trace that typically resulted when a cloth had been wrapped around an implement to facilitate manipulation of the mechanism without leaving fingerprints. This last detail had produced a visible shift in the inspector's expression, followed by a somewhat embarrassed acknowledgement that his lordship was correct and that he had perhaps been overly hasty in his initial assessment of the scene. Wimsey had then turned his attention to the room itself, moving through it with the unhurried grace of a man conducting a leisurely survey rather than an urgent investigation. He had examined the position of the desk, the location of the fire grate, the arrangement of the furniture, and had noted the precise spot where the body had been discovered, in the leather chair beside the desk, oriented toward the window. He had then produced the book, which remained in the custody of the local constabulary pending the formal inquest, and had observed that it was indeed a first edition of Marlowe's Faustus, a volume of considerable monetary value and considerable symbolic significance if one was disposed toward interpreting inanimate objects as bearers of meaning. The book had been marked, quite deliberately Wimsey had suggested, at a passage dealing with Faustus's final hours before damnation, a choice that struck him as either theatrically portentous or indicative of a mind preoccupied with questions of mortality and divine retribution. It was at this point that Marston had appeared in the doorway to announce that Miss Eleanor Corsham, the deceased's daughter, had arrived from London and was currently in the entrance hall awaiting permission to view her father's body. The inspector had prepared to depart to attend to this duty, but Wimsey had detained him with a raised hand and had inquired whether Miss Corsham had been expected to arrive at Ashcroft Manor. Carlyle had consulted his notes and had reported that there appeared to be no indication that she had been expected, or indeed that she had been informed of her father's death, with sufficient promptitude to allow her to arrange travel from the capital on such short notice. Wimsey had smiled that peculiar smile once more, and had suggested that the timing of Miss Eleanor Corsham's arrival was perhaps worth investigating, as it seemed extraordinary that a young woman residing in London should become aware of a death occurring in the Cotswolds so rapidly, and should be motivated to travel such a distance so expeditiously. Had the constabulary, he inquired, determined precisely when Miss Corsham had been notified of her father's demise and by whom that notification had been made? Inspector Carlyle's expression underwent the curious transformation that typically occurred when he was forced to acknowledge a gap in his investigative process, a phenomenon Wimsey had come to recognize as the visual equivalent of someone realizing they had neglected to lock an important door. The inspector consulted his notebook with the deliberate care of a man searching for information he suspected was not present, and had reluctantly confirmed that this particular detail had not, in fact, been thoroughly examined. A telephone call had been placed to Miss Corsham's residence in Kensington at approximately 4 o'clock on Saturday afternoon by Mrs. Pemberton, acting upon Mrs. Ashcroft's instructions, and the young woman had apparently been at home to receive the news. She had then made arrangements to travel by motor car immediately, arriving at Ashcroft Manor at approximately 8 o'clock that evening. However, and here the inspector's discomfort became palpable, no one had actually verified whether Miss Corsham had been genuinely at her London residence when the telephone call had been received, or whether she might have been elsewhere entirely, which raised rather awkward questions regarding the accuracy of the information contained in the constabulary's preliminary report. Wimsey had descended from the library with the measured pace of a man engaged in contemplation of matters, both profound and practical, and had proceeded to the entrance hall where Miss Eleanor Corsham was currently awaiting attention. She was a woman of approximately 30 years of age, possessing the kind of elegant features that suggested considerable attention to matters of grooming and personal presentation, and displaying the particular composure that typically characterizes individuals of independent means who have not been obliged to concern themselves unduly with the opinions of others. Her mourning attire, whilst appropriately dark, bore the unmistakable hallmarks of Bond Street tailoring, and her hands, which were folded with studied composure in her lap, bore no evidence whatsoever of the distress one might typically expect from a daughter recently bereaved. She rose upon observing Whimsy's arrival, and extended her hand with the grace of a woman accustomed to social interactions conducted at the highest levels of society. She had inquired, in a voice that possessed the crisp articulation of private education, whether Lord Peter Wimsey was indeed the gentleman she had heard mentioned in her father's letters, the man who possessed, according to those Miss Sayers, an unfortunate tendency toward detecting things that were better left undetected. This remark had produced a flicker of genuine amusement across Whimsy's features, and he had replied that he was indeed that gentleman, though he would dispute the characterization of his activities as unfortunate, at least from his own perspective, and from that of several individuals who might otherwise have been permanently inconvenienced by misunderstandings regarding the true circumstances of their situations. He had then expressed his condolences regarding her father's sudden demise, and had inquired whether she had been particularly close to her parent, or whether their relationship had been characterized by the sort of distance that often developed between fathers and daughters, when the former had devoted considerable attention to the accumulation of wealth, and the latter had developed independent views regarding the expenditure thereof. Eleanor had smiled, an expression that contained considerably more irony than one might typically expect to observe in the face of a recently bereaved individual, and had remarked that her father and she had maintained what might be described as a cordial but somewhat circumscribed relationship, predicated largely upon their mutual agreement not to inquire too closely into one another's personal affairs. He had been content to provide her with an adequate allowance, and she had been content to refrain from informing him of various matters he would have found distressing, an arrangement that had served them both remarkably well for some 15 years. Whimsy had guided her toward the drawing-room, where tea had been arranged with the efficiency that characterized well-managed households, and had seated himself opposite her with the air of a man prepared to engage in extended conversation. He had inquired, with the casual tone of one making idle social observation, whether her father had mentioned any recent developments in his personal life, financial complications perhaps, or relationships of a nature that might have caused him concern or distress. Eleanor had poured tea with studied attention to the precise temperature and color of the liquid, and had replied that her father had mentioned, in his last letter received approximately 1 week prior, that he was engaged in a somewhat delicate matter involving the acquisition of a particular item for his collection, an acquisition that required considerable discretion and had necessitated his consulting with individuals who operated rather outside the conventional channels of antiquarian commerce. She had not inquired into the precise nature of this transaction, as her father's habits of secrecy regarding matters of property and finance were well established, and she had learned long ago that inquiry into such matters typically resulted in lectures regarding fiscal responsibility and the dangers of feminine ignorance. At this point, Marston had appeared once more with the news that Mrs. Ashcroft had recovered somewhat from her migraine, and would receive visitors in her private sitting-room if they wished to speak with her further. Whimsy had thanked the butler and had turned to Eleanor with an expression of polite inquiry regarding whether she would wish to rest before engaging in further conversation, or whether she would prefer to accompany him to speak with Mrs. Ashcroft immediately. Eleanor had surprised him by setting down her teacup with decisive finality, and remarking that she would prefer to speak with Mrs. Ashcroft immediately, as she had observed from the moment of her arrival that something rather more serious than her father's cardiac event appeared to be occupying the attention of those in the household, and she was quite prepared to dispense with conventional pretenses and investigate the matter directly. This response had prompted Whimsy to revise his preliminary assessment of Miss Eleanor Corsham considerably upward, and to regard her with the expression of a man who has encountered an unexpected ally in pursuit of truth. Mrs. Ashcroft's private sitting-room was a chamber that bore the unmistakable imprint of a woman's personal aesthetic, considerably less oppressive than the public rooms of the manor, furnished with greater attention to comfort than display, and adorned with artwork that suggested genuine appreciation rather than mere accumulation of value. Catriona was positioned beside a window overlooking the gardens, her silhouette rendered somewhat ethereal by the fading September light, and she turned upon hearing the entrance of her visitors with an expression that suggested she had been anticipating precisely this intrusion. She was, Whimsy observed, with the trained eye of a man accustomed to reading such indicators, considerably recovered from her earlier indisposition, though traces of genuine distress remained evident in the slight tremor that affected her hands and the careful manner in which she had arranged her features into an expression of courteous welcome. Eleanor crossed the room to embrace her with the ease of a woman accustomed to physical affection, and Catriona responded with the warmth of genuine affection, though Whimsy noted the faint hesitation, barely perceptible to the untrained eye, that preceded the gesture. The conversation that followed proceeded with the careful choreography of social interaction conducted by individuals aware that significant matters remained unspoken, and that the precise arrangement of words and silences would determine the trajectory of subsequent events. Eleanor had seated herself with deliberate proximity to Catriona and had inquired with the directness that seemed to characterize her approach to complex matters, whether there existed some difficulty regarding her father's death that extended beyond the straightforward medical explanation that had been advanced by the local physician. Catriona had exchanged a glance with Whimsy that contained sufficient complexity to suggest volumes of unspoken communication, and had then turned to Eleanor with an expression that seemed to blend resignation with profound sorrow. She had begun to speak, hesitated, and then had proceeded with the air of a woman who had reached the conclusion that further prevarication was both futile and counterproductive. There had indeed, she had explained, been a matter of some delicacy involving her late husband and your father, a matter that had caused considerable strain in their friendship, and had never been entirely resolved before your husband's death some 18 months ago. Whimsy had settled himself into a chair with the patient expression of a man accustomed to allowing others to conduct their own confessions at their own pace, and had employed the interval to observe the minute variations in posture and expression that typically preceded significant revelations. Catriona had explained that her late husband, Thomas, had been engaged in a business venture some 5 years prior involving the acquisition and sale of rare manuscripts and antiquarian volumes, a venture that had seemed perfectly respectable until it had become apparent that Thomas had been somewhat less than meticulous regarding the provenance of certain items in his inventory. One item in particular, a medieval religious manuscript of considerable historical and monetary value, had been obtained through channels that, whilst not technically illegal, were considerably more opaque than reputable dealers in such items typically preferred. Nathaniel Corsham had been offered this manuscript at an extraordinarily advantageous price, a circumstance that should have provoked inquiry but had not, principally because Corsham had been eager to acquire it for his collection and had preferred not to examine the circumstances surrounding its availability too closely. The manuscript had subsequently come under scrutiny by certain parties with legitimate claim to its ownership, and investigation had revealed that Thomas Ashcroft's involvement in its acquisition placed him in an extremely awkward position legally and socially. The matter had been resolved, eventually, through the intervention of individuals possessing both legal expertise and considerable discretion, but the resolution had necessitated the return of the manuscript to its rightful claimants and the absorption of the associated financial loss by those responsible for the irregularity. Corsham had initially offered to share the financial burden, but Thomas had declined, and this refusal had created a rift between the two men that had persisted until Thomas's death. More significantly, from the perspective of the current situation, Corsham had retained a detailed record of the entire affair, correspondence, receipts, and documentation that implicated Thomas in what could charitably be described as trafficking in stolen property, and less charitably as receiving stolen goods with intent to conceal. This documentation, Catriona explained with visible anguish, had been discovered among Corsham's effects upon his arrival at Ashcroft Manor, and she had been made aware of its existence through a discreet communication from Corsham himself. who had indicated that he intended to use this information as leverage to compel her cooperation in a matter of considerable personal importance to him. Eleanor had listened to this explanation with the absorbed attention of one engaged in assembling the pieces of a complex puzzle, and had then inquired, with remarkable directness, precisely what manner of cooperation Corsham had intended to extract through the application of this leverage. Catriona had closed her eyes briefly, and had replied that Corsham had wished for her to assist him in establishing the legitimacy of certain acquisitions he had made in recent years. Acquisitions that possessed somewhat questionable provenance, and that would benefit considerably from the endorsement of a woman of established reputation and social standing. In essence, he had wished to use her name and position to lend credibility to transactions that might otherwise attract unwanted scrutiny from customs authorities and international cultural organizations concerned with the trafficking of stolen artwork. Whimsy had observed this exchange with the expression of a man watching the final elements of a particularly complex mechanism fall into place, and had then inquired, with the deceptive mildness of tone that typically preceded his most penetrating observations, whether Corsham had provided any indication of how he intended to respond to a refusal to cooperate with his rather ambitious plan. Catriona had opened her eyes at this question, and had regarded Whimsy with an expression that combined gratitude for his discretion in articulating the matter with profound dread regarding what his articulation might ultimately uncover. She had replied that Corsham had been sufficiently explicit in his intentions. He had informed her that refusal would necessitate the submission of his documentation to the appropriate authorities, coupled with an anonymous communication to certain journalists who specialized in exposing financial impropriety among the wealthy and well-connected. The consequences for her personally would have extended beyond mere social embarrassment or legal complications. They would have past the destruction of her reputation, the potential seizure of her property pending investigation, and the virtual certainty of criminal proceedings against her late husband's estate. Moreover, Corsham had made it abundantly clear that such proceedings would have considerable collateral impact upon Eleanor, whose own reputation and financial security would be compromised by the scandal attendant upon such revelations. Whimsy had nodded with the air of a man acknowledging that matters had developed along precisely the trajectory he had anticipated, and had then inquired whether Corsham had provided any specific timeline within which his cooperation was required, or whether the threat had been advanced in more general terms intended to maximize the psychological pressure upon his victim. Eleanor had interjected at this juncture to observe, with considerable acuity, that her father had presumably selected the weekend at Ashcroft Manor as the occasion upon which to advance this proposal, creating a situation in which Catriona would be isolated from potential sources of counsel and support, and would be forced to contemplate the consequences of resistance whilst confined to proximity with her blackmailer. Whimsy had turned to Eleanor with genuine appreciation, and had remarked that she possessed a gift for logical analysis that was considerably more developed than one typically observed in individuals of her age and social background. Eleanor had smiled thinly, and had observed that one developed such gifts rapidly when one's father had made it abundantly clear that sentiment and familial obligation were subordinate considerations to fiscal advantage. She had then turned to Catriona and had inquired directly whether her father had indeed died of natural causes, or whether Catriona had taken steps to ensure that his blackmail scheme would not reach fruition through means more direct than legal resistance or social exposure. The silence that followed this question possessed a weight and density that seemed to compress the very air within the sitting room. Catriona had risen from her chair and had moved to the window, presenting her back to her interrogators, and had commenced speaking in a voice that possessed the hollow quality of an individual engaged in confession of a matter that had occupied her consciousness for considerable duration prior to actual articulation. She had not, she had explained, murdered Nathaniel Corsham in any conventional sense. She had merely assisted him in accomplishing what he had, she believed, genuinely intended to accomplish himself, the liberation of himself from a burden of conscience that had accumulated over years of unethical behavior and financial impropriety. Corsham, she had explained, had been a man profoundly troubled by his own actions, a man who had constructed an elaborate facade of confidence and authority that concealed a fundamental uncertainty regarding his own moral standing. In his final years, this psychological burden had begun to manifest in various symptoms: insomnia, excessive consumption of spirits, preoccupation with matters of death and damnation, as evidenced by his recent acquisition of the Marlowe text and his frequent references to questions of judgment and divine retribution. On Friday evening, upon his arrival at Ashcroft Manor, Corsham had requested a private conversation with Catriona. During this conversation, conducted in the library whilst the other guests had occupied themselves with preliminary dinner preparations, he had explained that he had determined to withdraw his blackmail demands and to provide her with the incriminating documentation in its entirety. However, he had also made it abundantly clear that he had decided, following considerable reflection and contemplation of his own moral status, that the appropriate response to his own ethical failures would be to remove himself from circumstances in which he might inflict further harm upon others. He had asked Catriona, with the deliberate formality of one making a legal request, whether she would assist him in this endeavor. He had specified the means: a particular cardiac stimulant that he had obtained through medical channels, administered in such a manner as to produce an outcome that would superficially resemble a natural event. He had explained that he wished for Catriona to serve as witness and facilitator, to ensure that his death would be interpreted as cardiac in origin, and to verify that his documentation had been properly destroyed in the aftermath of his demise. Whimsy had listened to this explanation without interruption, and Eleanor had maintained her silence as well, though her expression suggested that she was engaged in reassessing her preliminary conclusions regarding the nature of her father's death and the circumstances that had culminated in his demise. Catriona had continued her explanation by noting that she had agreed to participate in this arrangement not from any desire to rid herself of a blackmailer, but from a recognition that Corsham's psychological state had become genuinely precarious, and that his determination to effect his own removal from existence appeared both genuine and unshakable. She had assisted him in arranging the necessary materials, had been present whilst he consumed the substance in question seated in the library's leather chair, and had ensured that the documentation he had referenced had been consigned to the flames in the fireplace. She had then summoned the household assistants, feigning discovery of his body, and had allowed events to proceed along the trajectory they had naturally followed. Inspector Carlyle, she had reasoned, would accept the medical explanation without question, and the matter would be concluded without further investigation or public scrutiny. Whimsy had maintained his posture of attentive silence for a considerable interval following the conclusion of Catriona's confession, an interval during which the only audible sound had been the faint scratching of the wind against the window panes and the distant ticking of various timepieces distributed throughout the manor. He had then risen from his chair with a deliberate grace that characterized his movements and had positioned himself at the window beside Catriona, ostensibly to observe the darkening gardens, but actually, Eleanor had noted with acute perception, to afford his hostess a measure of privacy whilst she composed herself following the emotional exertion of confession. After a further interval of contemplation, he had turned to face both women and had commenced speaking in a voice that possessed the measured cadence of a man who had devoted considerable thought to the precise articulation of complex matters. He had remarked that Catriona's account of events possessed internal consistency and appeared to account for the salient facts that had emerged during his preliminary investigation: the manipulated Shutter Latch, the positioning of the Marlowe volume, the absence of conventional evidence of foul play, and the curious timing of Eleanor's arrival from London. However, he had continued, there existed certain elements of her narrative that appeared to require additional examination and clarification before he could arrive at a definitive understanding of what had transpired at Ashcroft Manor. During the hours preceding Corsham's death, Eleanor had interposed an observation to the effect that Lord Peter appeared to be suggesting that some portion of Catriona's confession was inaccurate or incomplete. suggestion that seemed to carry implications considerably more troubling than the straightforward assisted suicide that had been described. Whimsy had inclined his head in acknowledgement and had replied that the human tendency to provide explanations that, whilst containing substantial elements of truth, obscure or omit facts of particular psychological or emotional significance, was a phenomenon he had observed with considerable frequency during his years of engagement with criminal investigation. Individuals confronted with the necessity of confession frequently constructed narratives that were simultaneously confessional and self-protective, admissions of guilt that were coupled with circumstances that might render that guilt more comprehensible or sympathetic to external observation. He had then directed his attention to Catriona and had posed a question of deceptive simplicity had Corsham, in his final conversation with her, specified precisely which cardiac stimulant he had obtained, and had she observed him consume the substance in question, or had she merely accepted his assertion that he had done so. Catriona had exhibited a visible reaction to this line of inquiry, a subtle tensioning of her facial muscles and a brief hesitation before responding that suggested the accuracy of Whimsy's suspicion. She had replied, with obvious reluctance, that Corsham had not specified the precise nature of the substance and that she had not personally observed him consume it. Rather, he had excused himself to the library after their conversation, had informed her via messenger that he had completed the necessary arrangements, and had requested that she refrain from entering the library for a period of approximately 2 hours to allow the substance adequate time to achieve its intended effect. She had complied with these instructions and had subsequently discovered his body the precise manner she had described to Inspector Carlyle. Eleanor had then posed a question that appeared to strike at the heart of the matter. Had it occurred to Catriona that Corsham's provision of these specific instructions, the specification of a time frame, the request for privacy, and the deliberate arrangement of circumstances to suggest natural causation, might indicate that his purpose extended beyond merely ending his own existence? Whimsy had regarded Eleanor, with the expression of a man observing confirmation of a hypothesis he had formed, with considerable confidence, and had then addressed Catriona with the gentle but relentless precision that characterized his most penetrating interrogations. He had suggested that Corsham's actual intention had been not to end his own life, but rather to create circumstances that would appear superficially consistent with natural death, whilst actually providing Catriona with an elaborate false confession, a stratagem that would simultaneously accomplish his desire to rid himself of the incriminating documentation and would establish Catriona as the individual responsible for its destruction. By accepting his narrative of assisted suicide, Catriona had essentially accepted complicity in what might be characterized as a form of elaborate deception designed to render her vulnerable to future manipulation or exposure. Corsham, in essence, had arranged matters such that Catriona would carry forward the knowledge that she had participated in his death, creating a psychological vulnerability that would ensure her continued cooperation with any future demands he might advance. Catriona had collapsed into a chair with the physical manifestation of shock that typically accompanied the sudden realization of having been manipulated by an individual whose deception extended considerably further than initially apparent. Eleanor had ved to her side with the protective instinct of a daughter confronted with evidence of her parents' suffering, and had turned to Whimsy with an expression that combined gratitude for his exposition with curiosity regarding how his lordship had arrived at this particular conclusion. Whimsy had replied that the presence of the Marlowe volume, specifically the careful placement of the open pages upon the armrest, had suggested not the careless positioning one might expect from an individual in the grip of a sudden cardiac event, but rather the deliberate arrangement characteristic of an individual staging a scene for external observation. Furthermore, the manipulation of the shutter latch, which Catriona had not mentioned in her confession, suggested that someone had required access to the library from the exterior subsequent to Corsham's apparent death. He had then posed the question that seemed to strike at the foundation of everything that had been previously discussed. Had Corsham actually died at all, or had the entire elaborate arrangement been constructed to create precisely the circumstances that had now manifested? The silence that descended upon the sitting room in the aftermath of Whimsy's question possessed a peculiar quality, not merely the absence of sound, but rather an active, almost tangible silence that seemed to compress the very atmosphere surrounding the three individuals present. Eleanor had been the first to respond, her voice emerging with the careful precision of one engaging in logical analysis, divorced from emotional distraction. She had observed that if Corsham had not actually died on Saturday afternoon, then his body could not have been present in the library when Mrs. Pemberton had ostensibly discovered it at 3 o'clock. Unless, Eleanor had continued with the relentless logic that appeared to characterize her approach to complex matters, either the body discovered by Mrs. Pemberton was not actually Corsham, or the discovery itself had been staged with considerably more elaborate preparation than a simple manipulation of shutters and the arrangement of a book. Whimsy had smiled with the expression of a man whose preliminary assessment of an individual's intellectual capacity had been thoroughly vindicated, and had replied that Miss Eleanor had articulated the matter with admirable precision. The body discovered by Mrs. Pemberton had indeed been Nathaniel Corsham, deceased, with the precise circumstances of that death remaining somewhat more complex than the preliminary medical examination had suggested. Catriona had raised her head from her position of collapse and had regarded Whimsy with an expression that blended confusion with dawning comprehension. She had inquired, her voice barely above a whisper, whether his lordship was suggesting that she had not in fact participated in Corsham's death at all, that the entire conversation she had conducted with Corsham on Friday evening had been part of an elaborate deception constructed specifically to manipulate her into believing she possessed guilty knowledge of his demise. Whimsy had approached her with a gentle solicitousness that characterized his interactions with individuals in genuine psychological distress, and had seated himself opposite her in order to conduct his explanation, at a level that would permit her to observe his expression during his articulation of what he had concluded regarding the sequence of events. He had explained that Corsham's conversation with her on Friday evening had indeed been genuine in its emotional content. He had genuinely wished to unburden himself regarding his blackmail scheme, and he had genuinely intended to provide her with the incriminating documentation. However, the manner in which he had proposed to accomplish these objectives had been considerably more complex than a straightforward assisted suicide. Corsham, Whimsy had explained, had ingested a substance on Friday evening, but not a cardiac stimulant of the sort that would produce rapid and dramatic cardiac failure. Rather, he had consumed a slow-acting compound that would produce the appearance of cardiac distress over a period of hours but would not result in actual death until considerably later. He had then proceeded to arrange matters such that he would be discovered in the library at precisely 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, at which point he would be unconscious but not deceased, a state that would superficially resemble death to observers lacking medical expertise, but that would permit him to recover once the immediate crisis had passed. Eleanor had interrupted to inquire how such a stratagem could have been accomplished without the cooperation of Mrs. Pemberton or some other member of the household who possessed intimate knowledge of the manor's operations. Whimsy had replied that it had not required such cooperation. It had required only that Corsham possess accurate knowledge of the household's daily routine, information that would have been provided by Catriona during their Friday evening conversation. Corsham had known that Mrs. Pemberton would open the library shutters at approximately 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, as this was her established practice on days when the weather was suitable. He had also known that the local physician, when summoned to examine an apparently deceased individual of Corsham's age and apparent health, would conduct only a cursory examination before pronouncing cardiac death. He had furthermore known that Inspector Carlyle, confronted with a case that appeared to involve natural death in an individual without apparent enemies or motives for murder, would be disinclined to pursue extended investigation. The elaborate deception regarding the blackmail scheme and his purported desire for Catriona's participation in his death had been designed to accomplish two objectives simultaneously. First, to provide Catriona with an explanation for his apparent death that would render her less inclined to question its circumstances, and second, to establish in her mind the false conviction that she possessed guilty knowledge of his demise a conviction that would render her psychologically vulnerable and emotionally isolated following the discovery of his body. However, and here Whimsy's tone shifted into the register that typically preceded his most significant revelations, the stratagem had failed in its ultimate objective because Corsham had not, in fact, recovered from his induced state of unconsciousness. Eleanor had posed the obvious follow-up question: if Corsham had intended to recover and had arranged circumstances to permit such recovery, what had transpired to prevent that recovery from occurring? Whimsy had risen from his chair and had moved toward the window, his expression suggesting that he was contemplating a matter of considerable psychological complexity. He had replied that this was precisely the question that had necessitated his examination of the library's shutter mechanism and his reconstruction of the precise timeline of events. The answer to that question, he had suggested, would require the cooperation of both women in clarifying certain details regarding the household's activities during the interval between Corsham's retirement to the library on Friday evening and the discovery of his body on Saturday afternoon. More specifically, he had inquired whether either woman had been outside the manor during Saturday morning, or whether either had possessed reason to access the library through means other than the conventional entrance during that period. Eleanor had responded to Whimsy's inquiry with a candor that suggested she had arrived at certain conclusions independently and recognized the futility of continued prevarication. She had acknowledged that she had indeed been outside the manor on Saturday morning, having arisen at an unusually early hour and having ventured into the grounds ostensibly for the purpose of observing the gardens in their early morning configuration. However, she had admitted with visible reluctance her actual purpose had extended considerably beyond botanical appreciation. She had received a communication from her father on Friday evening, a communication that had been delivered by messenger whilst the household was occupied with dinner preparations, in which he had outlined his intentions regarding his apparent death and had requested her participation in certain matters that would require her to be present at Ashcroft Manor during the precise interval in which his unconscious state would be most vulnerable to external interference. He had provided her with explicit instructions regarding access to the library through the exterior shutter, the precise timing required for his recovery to proceed without complication, and the necessity of ensuring that no member of the household would be positioned to observe his gradual return to consciousness. Catriona had risen from her chair with the sudden manifestation of genuine shock that exceeded her earlier reactions to Whimsy's explanations. She had inquired, her voice trembling with tea, weight of betrayal, whether Eleanor was suggesting that Corsham had deliberately placed his daughter in a position of psychological and legal complicity with a deception that extended far beyond the boundaries of filial obligation. Eleanor had turned to face both Whimsy and Catriona with an expression that blended sadness with a steely determination that suggested she had long since arrived at terms with the complexity of her father's character and motivations. She had replied that her father had indeed positioned her precisely where he had intended her to be positioned. As a witness to his elaborate deception, yes, but more significantly, as an individual who would bear responsibility for ensuring that the deception proceeded according to his specifications. However, she had continued with the precision of one articulating a matter that had occupied her consciousness for an extended period. Circumstances had developed in a manner that her father had not anticipated, and she had been forced to make decisions that diverged substantially from his outlined intentions. Whimsy had resumed his seat with the air of a man preparing to listen to an explanation that would illuminate the precise mechanisms through which intention and outcome had diverged so dramatically. Eleanor had commenced her explanation by noting that she had arrived at the manor on Saturday morning at approximately 7 o'clock, having concealed her motor car in the copse adjacent to the eastern boundary of the property. She had accessed the library through the exterior shutter, precisely as her father had instructed, had confirmed that he remained in the unconscious state he had described, and had positioned herself to maintain observation of his condition, whilst ensuring that no member of the household would inadvertently discover his presence during the interval in which the recovery process would presumably commence. However, at approximately 8:30 on Saturday morning, she had observed through the library window the arrival of an unfamiliar motor car at the manor's front entrance, and the emergence of two individuals who had the unmistakable appearance of individuals engaged in official business of a somewhat sinister variety, men whose bearing and demeanor suggested law enforcement or governmental authority. These individuals, Eleanor had explained, had been admitted to the manor by Marston and had proceeded directly to the library, where they had engaged in conversation with her father's inert form as though speaking to an individual capable of comprehension and response. She had been unable to hear the specific content of their conversation through the closed window, but the pattern of their interaction had suggested that they were aware of her father's condition and that they possessed some foreknowledge of his planned deception. At that point, Eleanor had explained with a voice that had become considerably harder in quality. She had recognized that her father's elaborate stratagem had been compromised by factors beyond his control or knowledge. She had been forced to make a rapid decision regarding whether to reveal her presence and attempt to warn her father of the complications that had arisen, or to remain concealed and permit events to proceed along whatever trajectory they would naturally follow. She had admitted, chosen the latter course. She had observed from her position of concealment as these mysterious individuals had extracted her father from the library through the exterior shutter and had transported him to their motor car, which had then departed the manor's grounds with considerable urgency. Catriona had interrupted Eleanor's narrative with a question that possessed the quality of genuine bewilderment if Eleanor had observed her. Father being removed from the library by these mysterious individuals on Saturday morning, how could she subsequently claim to have discovered his body in the library at 3 o'clock in the afternoon? Eleanor had paused at this juncture, and Whimsy had observed the momentary hesitation that preceded her response with the intense interest of a man engaging with the critical juncture at which deception and truth intersected at their most complex interface. Eleanor had replied that she had not, in fact, been the individual who had discovered her father's body. That discovery had been made by Mrs. Pemberton precisely as had been reported by the constabulary. However, Eleanor had continued, the body that had been discovered at 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon had not been her father as he had existed when the mysterious visitors had removed him from the library at approximately 8:30 that same morning. Rather, it had been her father, as he had been returned to the library sometime between mid-morning and early afternoon, returned not in an unconscious but recovering state as he had anticipated, but rather in a state of permanent cessation, his elaborate stratagem having terminated in precisely the manner he had purportedly wished to avoid. Whimsy had listened to Eleanor's revelation with the expression of a man observing the final pieces of an exceptionally complex puzzle assume their designated positions, and he had then posed a question that seemed to strike at the heart of the matter with surgical precision. Had Eleanor possessed any knowledge whatsoever regarding the identity of these mysterious individuals who had removed her father from the library, or had she maintained her observation without attempting to ascertain their purposes or affiliations? Eleanor had replied that she had recognized one of the individuals, though she had not initially placed the cognition until considerable subsequent reflection had illuminated the connection. The individual in question had been a man named Thaddeus Blackwood, a former associate of her father's from his early years engaged in the acquisition and sale of antiquarian materials, a relationship that had been severed some 10 years prior, following what Eleanor had understood to be a disagreement regarding financial matters and the proper allocation of profits derived from certain joint ventures. Her father had, on several occasions, made reference to Blackwood in a manner that suggested lingering resentment and a conviction that he had been defrauded of considerable sums through Blackwood's manipulation of accounting practices and deliberate misrepresentation of transaction values. Catriona had interjected at this juncture to observe that if Blackwood had been aware of Corsham's elaborate deception regarding his apparent death, then the logical explanation for his removal of Corsham from the library would be that he intended to exploit Corsham's unconscious state for purposes of his own, perhaps to recover monies that he believed he was owed, or to compel Corsham's cooperation in some scheme that required Corsham's participation. However, she had continued, such exploitation would seem to require Corsham's eventual recovery and restoration to consciousness, unless Blackwood's actual intention had been to ensure that Corsham did not recover at all. Whimsy had risen from his chair and had moved toward the fireplace, where he had stood in contemplation of the flames with the expression of a man engaged in assembling the final elements of a complex narrative. He had then turned to address both women and had commenced an explanation that appeared to integrate all the disparate elements that had emerged during the course of their investigation into a coherent and logically consistent who. Lay. Corsham, Whimsy had explained, had constructed his elaborate deception upon the assumption that his unconscious state would extend for a precisely specified duration, and that his recovery would proceed along a predictable trajectory. However, this assumption had been predicated upon Corsham's belief that he would remain within the comparative security of Ashcroft Manor throughout the period of his unconsciousness. The arrival of Blackwood and his associates had fundamentally altered this circumstance, creating a situation in which Corsham's unconscious form had been removed from a controlled environment and subjected to unknown conditions and unknown purposes. Eleanor had attempted to observe Blackwood's vehicle during its departure, but had been unable to ascertain its destination or the nature of the location to which Corsham had been transported. The logical conclusion, however, was that Corsham had been removed to some location where Blackwood could conduct interrogation regarding the disposition of the funds that he believed he was owed, interrogation that would necessarily be conducted in the assumption that Corsham would eventually recover consciousness and would therefore be capable of providing the information or access to funds that Blackwood required. However, Whimsy had continued, Blackwood's assumption had been rendered inaccurate by a circumstance that neither Corsham nor Blackwood had adequately anticipated. The substance that Corsham had ingested on Friday evening was a compound of considerable sophistication and specificity, one that had been obtained through medical channels, and that depended for its safe administration upon precise control of environmental conditions and the maintenance of specific physiological parameters. The removal of Corsham from the comparatively stable environment of Ashcroft Manor and his transportation to an unknown loca. Tian had subjected his unconscious form to variations in temperature, movement, and environmental stress that his body had been incapable of withstanding. The substance that was intended to produce unconsciousness followed by recovery had instead produced a state of medical emergency that had progressed inexorably toward terminal cardiac failure, accelerated rather than prevented by the trauma of transport and interrogation. By the time Blackwood had recognized that his captive was not going to recover consciousness, but was rather in the process of dying, it had been considerably too late to reverse the physiological deterioration that had already commenced. Eleanor had added to this explanation with a detail that suggested considerable observation and logical deduction on her own part. Blackwood had returned Corsham's body to the library some time in the mid-morning hours, replacing it in the leather chair with the care of one attempting to disguise the circumstances of its removal and restoration. He had then manipulated the exterior shutter to create the false impression that the window had been closed throughout the relevant interval, and had departed with the apparent intention of allowing the body to be discovered as though Corsham had never left the library at all. The Marlowe volume had been positioned, Eleanor had suggested, not by Corsham during his Friday evening preparations, but rather by Blackwood himself, as a deliberate theatrical touch, intended perhaps to suggest suicide or to create confusion regarding the precise circumstances of death. Whimsy had nodded with the expression of a man whose conclusions had been thoroughly vindicated by the emergence of supporting evidence, and had then posed the final question that seemed to complete the architecture of the narrative. Did Eleanor possess any knowledge whatsoever regarding where Blackwood might currently be located, or whether he had departed the county entirely in the aftermath of his catastrophic miscalculation? Eleanor had responded to Whimsy's inquiry with a precision that suggested she had devoted considerable thought to the question of Blackwood's subsequent movements and potential whereabouts. She had explained that her father had maintained, in his private correspondence with her, certain references to locations and individuals that had been of significance during his early career in the antiquarian trade, references that had suggested ongoing concern regarding Blackwood's activities and movements. Among these references had been a property located in the Welsh borderlands, a country house that had reportedly been acquired by Blackwood approximately 7 years prior, and that had been utilized, according to her father's somewhat oblique references, as a repository for items of questionable provenance, pending their eventual sale through channels that maintained appropriate distance from their origins. Eleanor had furthermore noted that Blackwood had been known to maintain a substantial collection of motorcars at this property, and that he had established a pattern of departing the county whenever circumstances had demanded discretion or when legal complications had threatened to emerge. The logical conclusion, Eleanor had suggested, was that Blackwood would have retreated to this Welsh property following the catastrophic termination of his scheme to extract information from the unconscious Corsham. Wimsey had listened to this explanation with the air of a man receiving confirmation of a hypothesis he had already formed through independent analysis, and he had then excused himself from the sitting room with the observation that he required a brief period in which to attend to certain matters of correspondence. He had departed before either woman could formulate a response to this announcement, leaving Catriona and Eleanor alone in the sitting room with the accumulated weight of revelations and the profound uncertainty regarding what consequences would attend the disclosure of these elaborate deceptions to the civil authorities. Inspector Carlyle had been conducting routine interviews with the remaining members of the household staff throughout the afternoon, and Wimsey had determined that the time had arrived to provide that gentleman with a considerably more complex and accurate account of the circumstances surrounding Corsham's death than had been provided during the preliminary investigation. He had accordingly composed a detailed memorandum outlining the sequence of events, the involvement of Thaddeus Blackwood in the death, and the specific location where Blackwood could be anticipated to be found, and had entrusted this memorandum to Marston with instructions that it be transmitted to Inspector Carlyle with appropriate urgency. The events that followed proceeded with the mechanical efficiency that typically characterized official investigations once the investigative apparatus had been provided with precise direction and specific targets. Inspector Carlyle had arrived at the Welsh property in question at approximately 9 o'clock on Sunday morning, in the company of representatives from the constabulary of the county in which the property was located, and had discovered Thaddeus Blackwood engaged in the process of loading various items into a motor car with the evident intention of departing the property with considerable urgency. Blackwood had resisted apprehension, and in the course of that resistance had made certain incriminating statements regarding Corsham's death that had effectively precluded any possibility of legal defense based upon claims of accidental causation or unintended consequences. He had been taken into custody and had been transported back to the county for formal charging with offences relating to unlawful detention, assault, and the culpable homicide that had resulted from his removal of Corsham from Ashcroft Manor and his subsequent failure to provide medical attention when the deterioration of Corsham's physical condition had become apparent. The official inquest into Corsham's death had convened on the following Wednesday and had concluded, following testimony from Wimsey, Eleanor, and Inspector Carlyle, that Nathaniel Corsham had died as a result of cardiac failure precipitated by trauma and psychological distress inflicted during his unlawful detention by Thaddeus Blackwood. The discovery of the elaborate deception that Corsham had constructed regarding his apparent death had required careful navigation by Wimsey during his testimony, as he had been obliged to provide sufficient explanation to account for the presence of the manipulated Shutter Latch and the peculiar positioning of the Marlowe volume without simultaneously implicating Catriona in what would otherwise have appeared to be complicity in Corsham's death. He had accomplished this objective through the careful articulation of his deductions in a manner that suggested that the manipulation of the shutter and the positioning of the book had been accomplished by Blackwood in the aftermath of returning Corsham's body to the library, and that Catriona's only involvement in the affair had been her acceptance of Corsham's confidential communications regarding his psychological state. The conclusion of the inquest had been attended by considerable relief on the part of Catriona and Eleanor, though each woman bore upon her countenance the unmistakable marks of individuals who had been subjected to profound psychological trauma, and who had emerged from that trauma with substantially altered underst. understanding of the complexities that could underlie apparently straightforward family relationships and financial arrangements. Wimsey had remained at Ashcroft Manor for one additional day, during which he had spent considerable time in conversation with Eleanor regarding her observations during the Saturday morning interval and her subsequent participation in the unmasking of the deception that had culminated in her father's death. On the evening prior to his departure, he had been found by Eleanor in the library, standing before the window through which Blackwood had removed Corsham's unconscious form, contemplating with the expression of a man engaged in philosophical reflection upon the intersection of human intention and unintended consequence. Eleanor had inquired whether his lordship possessed any final observations regarding the affair, and Wimsey had replied that he possessed a considerable number of such observations, though few of them were of any practical utility or capable of being articulated with sufficient precision to warrant extended discussion. He had noted, however, that the affair had illustrated with considerable clarity the degree to which elaborate schemes constructed upon the foundation of psychological manipulation and assumed human behavior could unravel with devastating rapidity when circumstances altered in unexpected fashion. Corsham had constructed his deception upon the assumption that his actions would remain secret and unobserved, and had failed to account for the possibility that his past contained individuals possessed of both motive and opportunity to intervene in his carefully orchestrated plans. Blackwood, in turn, had constructed his scheme of exploitation and extortion upon the assumption that Corsham's unconscious state would be sufficiently stable to permit interrogation, and had failed to account for the medical complexities inherent in maintaining an individual in a chemically induced state of unconsciousness under conditions of stress and trauma. In the end, human beings were creatures of remarkable capacity for deception, but also creatures of remarkable incapacity for anticipating the full consequences of their deceptions when external variables intervened to disrupt their calculations.